All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening for the webinar presentation by Dr. Kevin Kruse entitled Fault Lines, Polarization and Partisanship in America Since the 1970s. This webinar is brought to you by the National Council for History Education with the generous support of a Technology's Impact in American History grant from the Library of Congress. The National Council for History Education provides professional and intellectual leadership to foster an engaged community committed to the teaching, learning, and appreciation of diverse histories. We have a variety of professional activities for anyone interested in history and how we teach it, including webinars, colloquia, professional development, online trainings, and conversations with noted historians and history educators. If you like what you're seeing from us, we encourage you to become a member of the National Council for History Education. You can do so by visiting us on the web at www.ncheteach.org and click on join. You can also look around our website and find all our great content, including some of our upcoming colloquia, upcoming webinars, and our weekly web series with Joanne Freeman, which airs on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern. Some guidelines for tonight's presentation. If you're comfortable doing so, we encourage you, please include your name and location in the chat box, as well as any comments that you have along the way. It goes without saying to please keep your comments appropriate and germane to Dr. Kruse's presentation. If you have questions for Dr. Kruse as he gives his presentation, please put those in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Following Dr. Kruse's presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible from participants. We are pleased this event is being live streamed for closed captioning. If you need closed captioning services, simply click on live on the custom live stream service and view stream. If you need a direct link, you'll notice one in the chat prior to the beginning of Dr. Kruse's talk. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kevin M. Kruse. He is the professor of history at Princeton University, where he teaches 20th century American history with special interest in struggles over race, religion, and rights. He is the author of White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism, One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, and Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Kruse to join us this evening. Dr. Kruse?
Hi, okay. You start my video now?
Yep, go right ahead.
It says you stopped the video, or the host.
Oh, does it? You should be able to share. Is it not letting you?
It's not letting me.
I'm going to make you a co-host, and that usually solves the problem.
There we go. Usually does. Let's start it there.
Hey, there you go.
There we go. All right. Hey, everybody. First of all, thank you, Matthew, and the NCHE staff for having me for this. It's a pleasure talking to other historians and history educators out there. And what I want to do today is really talk. I'd really like to have a conversation as much as possible. I have a talk on this book I could give, but I think we've all, in the age of Zoom, have run out of patience with people kind of droning on into a camera in our face and not hearing anything back. So I'm going to avoid doing that and rather just have a loose conversation. So I'd really love to see your questions, and I hope we get to as many of the Q&A as possible. I really want to save time for that. And my topic tonight, I think, is partisanship and polarization since the 1970s. And it's a discussion I want to have built out of a book I did with my colleague Julian Zelizer. And the book was called Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. And the book came out of a class. It came out of the classroom. When I got to Princeton, I inherited a class that I think had been designed in probably the 1950s. It was U.S. since the 1920s, and it was in a series of classes where there were about 30, 40-year chunks. Civil War, Reconstruction. Shamolins does kind of the early 19th century. It was in that sequence. The problem was time kept marching on after 1950 when they created this course. And by the time I got it, I had about an 80-year span when I started there in 2000 that I had to deal with. So I was always looking for a chance to carve it up. And when Julian joined the faculty in, I think, 2007 or so, we looked for a way to divide this course up so he could have a big lecture course. And we decided to split it at 1974. That may seem like a really weird year for you. So let me explain why we decided to split it there. We really see the post-74 period as one that really deserves its own treatment, that really deserves its own attention. When I started college at the University of North Carolina in 1990, World War II, the end of World War II was 45 years before, right? Which seemed like distant, ancient, capital H history, right? Well, when freshmen come to our classes now, 1974 is more than 45 years ago. That is ancient history to them. And we need to stop thinking of it as kind of a coda that we tack on to the end of this history story that we usually tell about the 20th century, and instead think about the ways in which it is its own specific period, right? It deserves its own study. It can't simply be the tail end of the post-war era. It's its own era in its own right. And we've argued it's high time we think of it that way. So again, why 74? Well, the obvious answer is we're a couple of political historians, and Watergate happens in 1974. Watergate has been in the background of our consciousness for a long time, especially the last few years, as we've impeached another president twice. But Watergate, we have to remember, at the time was a huge shock. Richard Nixon had been reelected in 1972 with a massive landslide, a huge victory, one of the biggest of the 20th century. And then less than 2 years later, driven from office, resigns in disgrace. His vice president, also elected on the ticket, had resigned in disgrace. These are huge shocks to the political system, huge shocks to what Americans thought they knew about politics. It kind of ushered in a new era of mistrust, of scandal, and everything that came with it. That's not the only change that happens around that time, though. If you think about that period, that kind of a broad 1974 from, say, 73 to 75, there's a lot going on in foreign policy. That's America's withdrawal and humiliation from Vietnam, which is a huge shock to America's sense of itself as the major superpower, or one of two major superpowers in the world. This confident, aggressive foreign policy America had suddenly came to a screeching halt. That forced a new sense of limitations on America. At the same time, 1973 is the Opec Oil Embargo, right? Which is a huge shock to Americans' confidence about the economy. Suddenly, Americans realized they weren't this independent, thriving economy, or rather were beholden to these nations that most Americans hadn't even thought of before. And suddenly, they had incredible power over America. Or think about in terms of gender relations. 1973 is Roe v. Wade, right, which ushers in the kind of the new era of fights over family values, fights over reproduction, of contraception and abortion, of course, fights we're still living in today. Or in terms of race relations, the 1970s, 1975, a year after 1974, is the big anti-busing riots in Boston, a sense that the integrationist project, which had seemed so successful by the end of the 60s, had come apart, and that something had gone horribly wrong. And certainly we're living with the cost of that today. Or on and on. These changes happened in 73, 74, 75, and it seemed to be a rupture, right? And so what we chronicle in the book are the way in which, from that point on, American society became increasingly riven along four main fault lines, as you may have guessed from the title. And they are fault lines of political polarization, economic inequality, racial and ethnic conflict, and fights over gender and sexuality, the kind of the family values struggle. Now, it's not that earlier era didn't have lines of division. It certainly did. It's on race. This is the era of legalized segregation, of Jim Crow for much of that era. In terms of gender divisions, there was certainly a very clear sense of what men should do and women should do, a very clear oppression of gays and lesbians. Those lines were firmly in place, and it was good that they were erased. But in that earlier era, those kinds of divisions were often papered over in a way by other major developments. There were centripetal forces that pushed back on those fault lines and kept Americans together. right? So we talk now about the so-called mainstream media. This is an era in which there really was a mainstream media. We really are talking about a handful of major metropolitan newspapers and the 3 network news programs, half an hour every night, who set the stage for the national conversation. People might disagree with what was being covered. There's a general sense of what the media was presenting, a kind of a clear unanimity. People on the fringes were off. The John Birch Society might have written newsletters, and kind of, the Trotskyites had stuff over here. But the kind of the mainstream discussion was really about this shared set of facts that everyone had agreed on, right? That helped hold people together. There was a general faith in the government this period too, right? From the triumph of World War II up till Watergate, the wheels had started to come off with the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Vietnam. But for the most part, there's a general trust in America. You look at the polls, it's pretty strong through this period. There's a belief that the federal government is looking out for ordinary Americans and that it can actually do some good in their lives, right? These are 2 really important things that I think we've lost sight of. And the third thing, which I don't think you can overstate it, is the economy is humming in this period. Thanks to the reforms of the New Deal state in the 1930s and the 40s, the post-war economy was one that was incredibly stable and thrived. It was an era in which, thanks to the prevalence of widespread union jobs, and union membership is at a peak in this period, that a lot of working class people found a way to move themselves into middle class comfort, found a way for their children to achieve true middle class status. There's a general belief that the rising generation, the baby boomers, would be better off than the ones before, than their parents. Right. So all those things helped push against the tensions and the class conflicts, the racial conflicts, the gender conflicts that appeared in that era. They get pushed together in that period. From 74 on, it works in the opposite way. You see forces driving the country apart, right? In politics, there's an ideological sorting that takes place. When people look back on the post-war period and talk about, wasn't it a great period of bipartisanship? It had to be, because the 2 parties were ideologically diverse. The 2 parties had liberals and conservatives in each, right? There were large numbers of conservative Democrats, largely Southern Democrats, but there were ones all over the country. There were large numbers still of liberal Republicans who thought of themselves as Lincoln Republicans, largely in the Northeast, but still in the Northwest, but still very prevalent in national life. And so what that meant was, no matter where you were on the ideological spectrum, you had to reach across the aisle to find your ideological counterparts, right? If you were a liberal Democrat, you made common cause with liberal Republicans. If you were a conservative Republican, you made common cause with conservative Democrats, right? So it looked bipartisan. What's happened since the 70s, really since the 60s, has been an ideological sorting, right? We don't have that kind of mixture, and instead it's moved further and further apart, to the point now where the most conservative Democrat is still to the left of the most liberal Republican, right? You can look at votes in Congress this very week to see that incredibly clear, for all the yelling and I think rightly so, against Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. They are still to the left of virtually every Republican out there, certainly in the Senate. And the same is true on the right. The most liberal rhino Republican, Susan Collins, whatever, is still in that camp. And what that ideological sorting has done is it's made the parties themselves not be vessels that contain all sorts of people across the ideological spectrum, but they are very partisan. And that means they have moved their parties further and further to the corner, right? Party primaries are one in which people, this is usually more true in the Republican Party, it's starting to be true in the Democratic Party too, they're more concerned about getting outflanked on the side, right? A Republican is worried about getting outflanked on the right. A Democrat is increasingly, I think, rightfully so, getting worried about being outflanked on the left. And so the parties are being drawn in that direction. This is furthered by structural changes. Campaign finance has gone into a level in which massive amounts of money are being spent on these races. There's nonstop fundraising, and that means you have to get attention from your side. And so you see people making pitches to be extreme. You can look at some people's congressional accounts on Twitter are all about kind of just building up outrage so they can cash in on that. There's been gerrymandering, which has made a lot of these districts are no longer swing districts, but are instead reliably red, reliably blue. Again, that encourages people politically to move to the extremes. In terms of economics, there's been increased, in fact, skyrocketing levels of the economic inequality. I said I started my job here in 2000. I used to be able to talk about economic inequality in the 20s as the high point of inequality in America. Not anymore. We're currently living in it. And so that gap between the pay of CEOs and ordinary workers is one that's gotten starker and starker. And again, it's come hand in hand, no accident, with the steady decay of union movements in America and people who have kind of spoken out for the economic power of the working class. In terms of race relations, again, not the era of segregation and discrimination, but there was a general sorting out that we talk about in the book, in which all sides really decided that the integrationist project, despite its successes in some public spheres, was one that they didn't really want. And so there was a retreat, as I argued in my first book, White Flight. There was a retreat of whites out into their own separate sphere in the suburbs. And at the same time, we've seen racial minorities do some of the same things through kind of a Black nationalism, through separatism. We saw this in the Black Power and the kind of the movements that came after it in the 70s, a real desire to kind of close ranks in and of themselves and not believe that the integrationist project could work. In terms of gender and sexuality, we certainly have seen a lot of progress over the years, but no progress comes without polarization. So the advancements on women's liberation, the advancements on gay rights, the advancements now on trans rights, these have all come with the attendant backlashes, and that has made things much more divisive. And these things, of course, all feed on each other, right? They're not just all siloed off as I've kind of described them there, but they reinforce. The parties feed on this division in terms of race or gender or class, and the politics amplifies it. So those are the four fault lines we talk about in the book. But the title also has a second meaning, because we also don't just talk about these fault lines, we talk about the discussion about who's at fault, the lines people are fed about who's at fault. And here's where the media comes into play, and where I think I can speak to our theme today of technology. And as the media changes over this period, it's some rapid developments in the kind of steady waves of information technology that changes it. And again, we go from that old era in which there was a short range of radio stations on the AM and FM dial you could get. There was a short range of, maybe a dozen, if you were lucky, television channels you could tune into, but usually just 4 or 5. To instead having, first of all, thousands of channels on cable television, which led to a proliferation, then to the internet, which led to almost an exponential growth in the number of options that were out there for people, to social media, in which individuals now don't need to listen to someone else. They can be the broadcaster. They're carrying around in their pocket, what would have been in the 1940s, an amazing broadcast studio. It's got a camera, it's got a microphone, and it can broadcast around the globe. That's an incredible development. And as these changes have gone on, at first people thought, oh, it's wonderful. This is going to open up, we're going to get more access. As we talk about in the book, there's a great line Jan Wenner from Rolling Stone has in the early 70s, where he's pining away for what will become cable news. Everyone can have their own channel, right? There'll be a channel for hippies and a channel for surfers and a channel for conservative news he gets excited about. He might have revisited that thought later on, but at the time, very excited. What happens, though, is all of these technological changes, they don't broaden the conversation. They do make it so you can reach out and find people everywhere. But when these technological changes, when these new media inventions try to reach out to us, they narrow their view. There's a theme that appears in early cable television in the 80s, and executives at places like CNN and ESPN and MTV, all of which come about in the late 70s and early 80s, kind of one after another. They talk about it as narrowcasting, right? Instead of broadcasting like the networks do, we're going to narrowcast. And so MTV says, we're just going to appeal to rock fans. And ESPN says, we're just going to appeal to sports fans, right? And CNN at the time was a novel concept of just giving people news. Well, that's a good way to find an audience, to make a connection with them on a narrow thread of things. But what it winds up doing is it winds up shrinking the amount of conversation that's out there. And so the initial promise of cable TV and then the internet and social media was, you can reach out to anyone. Well, but people don't want to reach out to anyone. They often want to reach out to people who think just like them. And so we find in this way a kind of a feedback loop in here, in which these networks, these cable networks, these internet sites, social media accounts, they create bubbles, which both bring together like-minded people, but shut out those on the outside, right? And it has an effect, as I think we've learned, clearly in the last few years. It's had a real effect on radicalizing a lot of people, of letting them think that their opinion, which once might have seemed extreme and no one else shared, is actually widely shared. And the fact that it's encouraged, it's amplified. And this is true in lifestyle areas, but really in politics, I think we see the real impact of this here today. So those are the big themes of the book, are these dividing lines we have, are the way in which Americans have become increasingly split on lines of race, gender and sexuality, politics and economics, and the way in which the media has reinforced these lines. And so what I'd like to do today, I see questions popping up here, is just to have a conversation with you. And we can talk about, Matthew said, don't talk about anything off topic. We're pretty much wide open here, post 74. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the history in this period, but also I'd love to chat with you if you have any questions or concerns about how to teach this history to younger students. Again, students who came up during this period, for whom this is not, I'm 49, this is my lifetime. A younger student was, I hate to break it to you, when they come to college now, they were born after 9/11, which is not even the midpoint of our book. So it's a bit of a challenge to try to communicate these things. But there's a hunger out there, I can tell you, on the part of these students to understand where their world came from. And I think the problem here is, again, the problem that animated this book in the first place, was that we realized that people weren't really treating this post-70s period as a discrete period. We were all treating it as kind of an add-on, an afterthought, a coda to the post-war era. And instead, what we needed to do was think of it as its own particular kind of historical conversation. And that's what I'm happy to talk about today. So I'd love to have any questions. I think Matthew might moderate them.
I'm here. I'll be happy to ask the questions. It might make it a little bit easier so you don't have to jump back and forth between screens.
Great.
So there are Kevin Jackson wants to know, what can we do to make things around polarization better? Policies, regulation, deregulation.
Yeah, I mean, and this is maybe one of the lessons of the book. I am more and more prone to pessimism these days, but I do think one of the lessons of the book is that this was a world of our making, right? We weren't forced into this. This wasn't some natural calamity. We kind of boxed ourselves into this position, and there are some things that we can do to unbox that. I think there are political reforms we can certainly do. The first one is the most pressing one of voting rights. The more people that vote, the less it's driven by kind of committed partisans on both sides. I think the bigger and the broader the process will be, and that will cut against polarization. We have to get people who do not live and breathe politics to take it seriously, and removing the barriers to voting and encouraging all Americans to take part in that process would do a lot, I think, to help that. Other structural changes, though, we could do. Gerrymandering has become a huge problem. We're seeing just right now this week some incredibly gerrymandered maps in places like Texas, I just saw, or Iowa. Democrats too. There's one in Illinois Democrats have done, which is pretty bad. And I get why they're doing it. If Republicans are doing it, they feel the need to kind of keep pace and don't want to unilaterally with disarm. But if some national reform could go through that would curtail gerrymandering, would put the shaping of congressional districts not in the hands of partisan legislatures, but instead in the hands of nonpartisan authorities, I think that would do a great deal of good. It would help really move at least the House races into something that was much more competitive. And so we have in many states now, both blue and red, we have these seats where as soon as the primaries run, you know who's going to win. And we've seen that kind of society before. That's what the Solid South was when the Democrats ran in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's an utterly anti-democratic South, which shuts down all political minorities, racial minorities too, in that case. So I think the more we can do on that end would be good. I also think we've got to do something about campaign finance. We had some decent reforms in place right after Watergate that were struck down by the Supreme Court. And so we now live in a world in the kind of the post decision in 1976 called Buckley v. Vallejo. In the wake of that decision, we live in a world in which politics has become increasingly a game for the rich. And that has really skewed who has been involved. Under the rules of Buckley v. Vallejo, there's no limits on how much you can self-fund your own campaign, which means a lot of millionaires and maybe billionaires have been running for office. And that's a problem. We need to have people who I think are more representative of the American people. But also, if we changed the campaign finance laws, these Congress people would spend less time. And for in the House, you basically get elected and sworn in, and then you start raising money for your next race 2 years later. They would have to spend less time, I think, on chasing money and appealing to donors, be they Hollywood stars or billionaires or corporations, most likely, and instead actually just doing their job, and not trying to kind of play for the partisan crowd. I think they'd be more willing to actually work across the aisle and get things done. So those are three, I think, solutions that I think would be not easy to do, but things we could do, right? They're within the range. There are some levels of partisan polarization in these other areas, which I don't think we can do. I mean, economic inequality, the New Deal showed us you can definitely apply some taxes to that and shift that. That could actually happen. In terms of the media divisions, though, I hear a lot of people saying they want to return back to the days of the fairness doctrine. Well, the problem is the fairness doctrine only applied to broadcast radio and television. It never applied to cable TV. And in fact, the rise of cable TV was a reason the court said we could get rid of the fairness doctrine because there was no need now for the networks to offer a fair and balanced position because cable had all these alternatives. Well, if we were to bring it back now, it couldn't apply to cable or the internet or things like that. So I'm not sure that's the route. I do think the internet is long overdue for some serious reforms. Right now, we basically have things like Facebook or whatever it's called today. I think they're changing the name. Facebook is largely free of any responsibility for what gets shared on its platform. They are essentially a broadcaster who is never held responsible for its content. And that, I think, is, if NBC or Fox News aired some of the things that come across Facebook with regularity, they could be held responsible in some ways. Facebook isn't. And so I think making them responsible, changing those measures, which were in a Telecommunications Act in 1996, would go a lot to alleviating those problems. Again, there's no single magic fix here. But I think the most important thing for us to do as citizens is to remember we're not locked into this world, right? We have, Americans have reinvented ourselves several times over. And again, this class I taught begins with Watergate for a reason, because it is kind of a rock bottom moment in which Americans try to create some reforms. Some last, some don't, but there's an effort to change, an effort to move forward. And that's something I think we can learn from them.
Where did my questions go? I had them here. Patricia wanted to know, how does the decline in people belonging to community organizations, the quote unquote bowling alone, relate to this period in partisanship?
I had lunch with Bob Putnam a couple ages ago. He was at Princeton and was very nice to have a lunch with a junior guy, and we talked about this. And I was in no mood to challenge him then. I'm not sure I am now. It's a powerful thesis about the way in which communities have fallen apart. But I think what we've seen here is the recreation of new forms of communities online. And so you can argue that's a very different kind of community than a bowling league or a church group. But for a lot of people, they fill those same roles. And I think that we've seen that those kind of community things haven't helped bridge the gap. They've instead again pushed people further and further apart. And I'm sure if he were here, Professor Putnam would argue that those only came about because we didn't have the earlier things. But it's certainly been a shift that has replaced that earlier sense of community. I mean, you can look at something like a QAnon. They are certainly a community, and they certainly have a set of beliefs and a set of support systems in place that hasn't bridged partisanship. So I think that's where we're at.
Susan would like you to talk a little bit about this is a very broad way of putting this, but what does it mean to be an American? And the question is, historically, was there more agreement about what defined an American, a general agreement, or has there never really been agreement on what it meant to be an American?
Susan, that's a great question. And no, there's never been an agreement about this. In fact, I'm teaching my course now. Again, it's 1920 to 1974. And I tell the students on the first day, the themes of this course are that we're going to discuss two big debates. What should America do? And who counts as an American, right? And I think the one real lesson from studying that question over time is that it's been a perennial concern, but the answer has always changed, right? And so the sense of who could count as an American has, in fits and starts, not perfectly, but it has steadily expanded over time. And that's, I think, to the great credit of this country and the people in it, who have long thought of themselves, even despite recent pushback, as a nation of immigrants, as a nation who welcomes in all comers, the wretched refuse from all over the world. And so when I talk about that mid 20th century period, it's one in which it steadily expands who counts as an American. And when I start out, I talk about in one of the early lectures how the Klan denounced Jews and Catholics as un-American, Catholics especially. My people were beholden to a foreign pope in Rome, and therefore we couldn't be truly American. Or how certain ethnicities, again, World War I, my people, the German Americans, were denounced as hyphenated Americans who were not truly American and needed to have their foreign loyalties driven out. Same thing true of the Irish and the Italians. How the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 was so upset that people had come here from Poland and Italy and Hungary and the Serbian countries. They were so upset about the changes. Russian Jews are a continual complaint. They're so upset about those changes that they not only decided to freeze immigration in the 1920s, but they froze it by a metric that was older. They went back and used the 1890 census because they didn't like who had become an American over those previous 30 years. So they reached back to 1890 and used that census to create this immigration restriction law. So we started in a period in which this sense of who is an American, Susan, is very constrained, right? And what I talk about in the course is over time, it gradually expands, right? And so Jews and Catholics are brought really into the political mainstream during the New Deal era, certainly by the election of John F. Kennedy. Racial minorities are steadily brought into the mainstream through the eradication of segregation. There are certainly incredibly ugly moments in here, not just in terms of Jim Crow, but racial internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. But again, something the country comes to regret and apologize for. And there's a steady march in which this idea of who counts as an American in terms of national origin, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of class, steadily expands over this period. And what I like to talk about in this class in the Nixon era is to remind them that at the start of the course, ethnic Americans, ethnic whites, Polish Americans, Greek Americans, whatever, were considered on the outs. They were considered not white. They were considered dangerous. They were part of this immigration wave that needed to be resisted by the true Americans. Who's Richard Nixon's vice president? Who's the man who's in charge of the silent majority language? Spiro Agnew, a Greek American. Within the span of his lifetime, Greek Americans went from being the antithesis of what a true American was to the embodiment of what a true American was, right? That's the kind of transformation we talk about here. And we've seen this with, if you move forward into the post-74 era, you've seen this continually expand and grow, all right? Again, waves of pushback, a welcoming of Muslims, a pushback after 9/11, a pushback in the Trump years for sure, but a general expansion of the way in which that kind of religious plurality, the kind of ecumenical religious nationalism has been expanded in this period. The same thing true of ethnic groups, the same thing true of on and on. And so whenever I see a current moment of some group being targeted for immigration restrictions, all I can think of is eventually that group will be the in-group, right? And I hope that they remember finally not to pull up the ladder after them. That was a long answer, Susan, but it was a great question.
I'll let you take a drink real quick. I do want to mention all you educators out there. There are a number of questions that are related to teaching and learning of this content. And I promise I am going to get to those, but I do have a couple more questions sort of related to the content, and then we'll address sort of the pedagogy behind it. First was George, who would like you to comment on the role that religion played in political polarization since 1974.
Oh, that's great. So this was my second book was on called One Nation Under God, was on this topic. And it started where I wanted to figure out where did this polarization brought by the religious right come from. And I thought I'm going to start looking in the 70s with the moral majority. That feels like a good place. Or maybe I need to look a little bit back into the 60s and the fight over school prayer. I knew that was a big issue. The problem was when I got into those archives for the 60s, I quickly learned that there was an older story. This is a classic historical research trap. You realize there's actually a prehistory you need to learn, and you keep moving back and back and back. But what I found in that book was that there's a religious nationalism that comes about in the 50s. In the book, I talk about its origins as kind of a fight against the New Deal. But right now, I want to zero in on that religious nationalism, because it's important to understand that when we got a lot of the trappings of religion and politics, and they came in short order, in a span of about 5 years, from 1952 to 1957, you get the mandated National Day of Prayer. You get what we now call the Presidential Prayer Breakfast, the National Prayer Breakfast every February where the president attends. You get Under God added to the Pledge of Allegiance. You get In God We Trust being the national motto. You get that phrase on printed currency for the first time, on postage stamps for the first time. You get the prayer meetings in Congress and the House and the Senate. You get the prayer room on Capitol Hill. The words "In God We Trust" are finally added to the Capitol in 1962. If you see when the president gives a speech, the Speaker of the House is up there, they're behind Nancy Pelosi. All of that religious nationalism came in short order, but it came with the hope of bringing Americans together. This idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition that you may have heard of is a relatively recent concept. As the historian Wendy Wall and others have noted, it really springs up in the mid-20th century as a way to paper over ethnic and racial division. And so it's really in the context of World War II, when Americans at home are looking to their home countries abroad at war. German Americans and French Americans are suddenly feeling their home countries are on the opposite side of the war. The country encourages them to think of themselves not in terms of their ethnic origins, but their common religious traditions. This is something Will Herberg talks about, the sociologist Will Herberg talks about. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are the three great faiths of democracy. They have this in common, right? They're all essentially faiths about individual salvation in one way or another. They're all faiths that kind of trace back to the same same religious roots in the Abrahamic tradition, and therefore are something that all Americans have in common. And so this religious nationalism, which was strongly encouraged by Dwight Eisenhower, we don't remember him enough for this, but this is how he thought of himself, of bringing this religious nationalism to the fore. I thought this would bring them together, right? There's a line Eisenhower says in December 22nd, 1952. He gives a speech to a group called the Freedoms Foundation, in which he says this famous quote of "Our system of government makes no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." Well, Eisenhower's critics mocked him for that. This was a very vague, very deeply felt religion, one of them said. But Eisenhower knew that if you were going to tie people together with religion, it had to be done lightly, it had to be done on these broad principles they all share. So the religious nationalism of this period is one that's marked by what the Yale Law School Dean Eugene Rostow calls ceremonial deism. And he meant this by ceremonial, it doesn't matter. Deism was it's always God, it's never Jesus Christ. But the deism, the ceremonial part was, he said, it doesn't really matter, it's ornamental. Well, but we live by ceremonies, as you know. We live by these traditions, these symbols, these customs. Look at the bumper stickers on the cars in traffic. Look at the flags at a political protest. We live by symbols. But this religious nationalism, this ceremonial deism of the Eisenhower era, was one that Ike thought could bring people together. Again, because it was vaguely drawn. It was all about the God that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all shared in common. Never about Jesus Christ, all about God. And that would bring people together. And that was the goal. Ike thought that religion and the people who followed him, that a national religious revival would bring Americans together in a common sense of purpose, that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and there's some references to Muslims in the 50s, and when Hawaii is added as a state at the end of a decade, suddenly a realization that there are a lot of Buddhists out there. There's a real sense that the religious traditions of America can encompass a wide range of religions, an assumption that Protestant or Christianity would remain at the core, but a welcoming of these other religious faiths. But in this era, they thought it could bring them together, right? They thought it could bring them together and it could do this job of uniting them. And it does for a few years. The problem comes when a later generation seizes on this language, not to unite Americans, but to divide them. And as I argue in the book, it really starts with Richard Nixon, who used this public religion as a club. He would bring Billy Graham out to excuse a Vietnam policy, or he would hold a massive religious revival, usually again with Graham, to paper over the Kent State shootings. He had preachers come into the White House for services in the East Room, where he used them. And they say, quite frankly, behind the scenes, we're using this for a political purpose, to lobby congressmen for bills, to press them on all kinds of changes, to get favors from CEOs who are in attendance, who would then write a check to Nixon because they love this service, things like that. So by Nixon's era, it starts to be a little more divisive. He's using this as a partisan wedge. And then in the era of the moral majority, it becomes a dividing line. And it's not used to bring Americans together. It is instead used, I think very purposely, to drive them apart. And so this religious nationalism, ironically, of the 50s, which all these things that happened of, in God we trust, or under God I do the pledge, were meant to bring Americans together. A later generation on the religious right points back to this earlier religious nationalism and says, how can we have legalized abortion? Aren't we one nation under God? We should have Christian prayer in school. We're in God we trust. They point back to these things to make an argument that they need to be more religion, their kind of religion only, in the public sphere. And so that's a moment in which it becomes much more divisive. And again, as religion goes from being this thing outside politics to this thing imbued with politics, it quickly takes on the traits of partisan politics, right? And you see there's certainly a religious left that goes to good ends, certainly in the civil rights era, the anti-war protests against Vietnam. There's a religious right that gets mobilized and actually uses that religious left as an example, and moves in a very different direction in the 80s and 90s, becoming an effective arm of the Republican Party. In fact, with the run of Pat Robertson for president in 1988, almost an official arm of the Republican Party. So religious nationalism was something that was meant to bring Americans together, to unite them as a nation, but instead it has devolved into this thing that has become a much more partisan wedge. And it's continuing to drive Americans apart.
Well, you mentioned the going back in the 50s and even prior to that, and please forgive me if I mispronounce this individual's name is Naresh. His or her question is, you mentioned the New Deal and the relative pre-74 consensus that the New Deal was a system that benefited the country, specifically the booming economy, and the consensus around economics and politics other than racial integration. It feels like conservative focus post-1974 has been to dismantle the New Deal, and the Democrats or liberals have largely gone along with this. or not put up sustained objections. First, do you agree with that assessment? And second, do you see our country ever returning to a New Deal type government?
Well, considering it was a 3-year-long economic crash that gave us the New Deal government, I hope we don't reach that point. But I would be optimistic that at some point we can see that period of reform. But again, seriously, those periods of reform only come after calamities. So I think that's something that would have to happen first. There has to be that kind of shock to the system to see that kind of systemic reform. I mean, in some ways, I agree with that framing. You certainly have seen an attack on labor rights from really, Reagan firing the air traffic controllers to the present. The triumph of right to work laws that came out of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 have been on the march with I think I would say dangerous consequences. So that level to undo the power of labor has certainly been there. In terms of challenging the vision that the New Deal had of an expansive and aggressive government, there's certainly been a rebellion against that. We lived in the last few decades in the shadow of the so-called Reagan Revolution, in which government was cast as a problem. FDR said in 1938, in a speech in Marietta, Ohio, he gave a speech and he said something like, "Our government is not some alien power thrust upon us. Our government is us." And that sense of the commonality between the people and the government was an important one of a New Deal. And again, why people thought the New Deal worked for them. All right, they were invested in this. If you haven't read it, Liz Cohn has a brilliant book called Making a New Deal. And I love it for many reasons. One of them is it gives a real visceral sense of the connection people had with the New Deal, with the president. They would write letters, "Dear Frank," they would point to the picture on the wall, and they had pictures on the wall of him and say, "He saved my job. He got me in school. He put my dad back to work." They had a real connection with him and the government he represented. That was there. With Reagan and on, you've had a trend on the right in which the government is treated as something hostile or incompetent, right? Reagan used to joke the most terrifying words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Reagan said that with a kind of a smile. It's gotten much more sinister in recent years. The current anger about the so-called deep state on the right is, I think, really remarkable. We're talking about civil servants and bureaucrats, but that's again something with a long history. George Wallace used to complain about those same people too. So there's been a real hostility to government in recent years. I think that's a real mark, the change to the New Deal. At the same time, it's kind of remarkable that some of the things that were the most unpopular and polarizing things about the New Deal have now become things that even conservatives will defend. And this is a shift that came in place even in the Eisenhower years. But look at what Eisenhower said about things like Social Security, or, well, he said union laws, those faded. But he said, if you touch Social Security, you're going to be in trouble. In the Reagan era, Reagan tried to tinker with Social Security, and he suffered a huge political defeat. That's where we get that great line from Tip O'Neill that Social Security is the third rail of politics, like the third rail on a subway. It's where all the electricity lies, and if you touch it, you die. And Republicans learned that lesson. In fits and starts again. George W. Bush tried to privatize it again and took a beating. But since then, it's become one of these things that even Republicans vow to defend. They vow not to touch. In fact, sometimes they complain that Democrats are messing with Social Security. We've seen this too with Medicare and Medicaid, mostly Medicare, two things that were, again, deeply divisive in the 60s and things that even the Reagan era tried and wanted to kind of roll back a bit, have become things that Republicans are championing today. So there has been some rollback, but a lot of these liberal policies are sticky, right? They create a constituency, they create expectations. Many people argue this is why conservatives fought so hard against the Affordable Care Act, was they thought that once people got this health insurance, it would be impossible to unwind. And we've sort of seen that, right? Republicans in 2012 ran on repeal and replace. Trump got in, had both houses of Congress with him, and couldn't repeal and replace Obamacare. There's just not the will to do that. So once these things stick, they stay there. The New Deal is a great example of that. A lot of it is faded away. A lot of some of it was struck down by the courts, some of it repealed in Congress, but a lot of it is still there. And I think that shows the kind of the lasting impact something like that can have.
I want to turn our attention for the last few minutes to sort of how we approach this in schools, because as you know, we're very interested in history education, and I think Walter has a good question to start this conversation, which is a recurring rhetoric trope is that it is wrong to teach young people that they are unique or that they can choose their own dream or life path. Attacks on Mr. Rogers symbolize this approach. How has this line of thought gained traction given the fault lines you described?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is in many ways, that kind of movement came from a leveling of differences, right? This is the complaint against everyone gets a participation trophy, right? Everyone gets a ribbon for competing. You're all equals and no one's a winner. That kind of argument came about because people were trying to lessen some of these divisions. And that I think has been where that originated from. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Sorry, I dismissed it.
No, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So how did that line of thought of, that it's wrong to teach kids that are unique, or sort of the Mr. Rogers symbol of what, how did that gain traction in the political fault lines that you described in your talk?
Well, I think it's the general shift to what political scientists have called the winner take all philosophy, right? And if you no longer believe in, if not equality, if you don't believe in equity, then you want a system in which there are clear winners and losers, and you want a system in which not everyone succeeds, or at least not to the same level. You need a certain set of inequalities, and that goes back to this idea that if everyone's special, they must all be equal in some way. They must all be at the same level, and if they're not, then they can't be.
Well, sort of riff off that is Emily's question. Putting some of this context in light of what's going on in high schools. And so Emily says, I teach high school 11th grade American history and 11th, 12th grade con law. And her students frequently ask how to fight polarization and partisanship without compromising their values to find a middle ground, particularly in the pre-voting age. Do you have any advice that you can share?
How to fight? I mean, to lobby for the things I suggested earlier, to do what they can to urge their representatives that they have now to curtail gerrymandering, reform campaign finance, things like that. I think what they can do on their own is just to do what they can not to become siloed off, right? It doesn't even have to change who they are, but just to have more interaction and more engagement with people who are not like them. And here, I mean, not just in terms of religious diversity or racial and ethnic diversity or things like that. I mean, just to hear out people, not all people, there are some people I want to hear out, but to hear out people who have a different view on a variety of things than you might, not just to dismiss them out of hand. And if only to make your own arguments sharper and not to become dull by simply never having to cross swords with anyone, to make your own arguments sharper, to make your own surety about that clearer, to get out and engage with them, even if it's just to tuss it up, but to have a conversation, right, I think is important. And so this is why if someone made a comment about being on Twitter, this is why on Twitter I try to follow a wide variety of people, people to my left, people to my right. Not that I'm going to agree with them. Often I don't, as you may see. And I'm not talking about like the Ted Kruses of the world. I'm talking about people I actually might hear from and listen to on to my right. But I find it makes things interesting for me, and I think it keeps me a little bit more on my toes. Right? I don't want to be complacent. So anything we can do to get out of our bubble, I think is good. Again, I read broadly magazine, Jacobin and National Review, or I try to watch Fox News every now and then. It's tough for a liberal, but I try to get out there and Wall Street Journal, things like that. So do whatever they can at that age not to become kind of hardened, right? I think one of the best things they can do is kind of to remain open, to remain excited, and to remain engaged. This has really been the one silver lining, I think, of the Trump years for me, is that it instructed a lot of people that democracy is not a spectator sport. I think too many people in my generation thought, oh yeah, I'm good. I vote every presidential election, or I vote every midterm too. I'm really involved. And what we've seen in the last few years is that's just not enough. You've got to be engaged, you've got to be mobilized, and more importantly, it can really make a difference. And so things like March for Our Lives, or the Me Too movement, or Black Lives Matter have really put things on the map that they hadn't been before. And I'd say my final thing to say to them is to remember, and this is why one of the things I love about American history, and we're actually in my lecture course, is by reminding them how many big changes in American history came from young people, and I start talking about Martin Luther King was 26 when the Montgomery bus boycott started, or Huey Newton was just younger than that when they started the Black Panthers, or the students who led the conservative Young Americans for Freedom, or the Students for Democratic Society in the 60s, they were college students, right? High school students like the Little Rock Nine, or Lillian Gobitas took cases to the Supreme Court. So young people can make change. And so I'm glad to hear they're looking to get involved and to fight what's going on. Tell them they can. It'll be an uphill climb, but they can actually make a difference.
Well, I want to turn our attention in the last couple minutes here. Amy asks a really good question, and something that I think every teacher of history faces, which is there's so many important events and issues of the 1970s and beyond that need to be taught. And you've really pointed these out. But teachers are severely limited by time. In your mind, how can we start to teach these important issues, 1970, post 1974?
Yeah, I hear as the words came out of my mouth that I was teaching a course on just a small chunk of time. I could hear the eyes roll from those of you who have to do all of American history in a year, or God forbid, in a single semester. But even in that short period, I find there's lots of stuff I want to talk about that I have to leave on the cutting room floor. So what I decided to do was not to give kind of thin coverage to everything, but to rather give kind of a quick overview throughout of kind of the broad timeline we're talking about, and do some deep dives into a couple big moments, right? So I do really deep dives into the New Deal, again, because I think of the transformation in politics. I do a really deep dive into the civil rights society and Great Society moment of the mid-60s, again, because it's a moment of reckoning on race and gender too. And I do those deep dives, and I give, I had a quick lecture on, on Truman. There'll be, one coming up on, I skip over JFK, except the civil rights part. There'll be one up on, on Nixon at the end, but really to dig into those two moments, and to do so because I think it's much more important than giving coverage to give complexity as much as we can, right? I think the problem we have as history teachers when we try to do everything is we don't do any of it well. And we wind up just giving kids a list of, and if you're teaching to a test, I feel your pain, but if you're not in that case, maybe you might be able to break with this. We just give them a list of names and dates to remember, and it's boring. That's not why we like history, the kind of the surface level names and dates. It's digging into the stories, it's getting into the details of what's going on underneath it. And that is what I try to give them. And so to dig into debates in the New Deal about, we did court packing and labor fights and Jim Crow over the last couple of weeks, to really get in there, right? To really get into the dirt and to get into there with primary sources is something I love to do, because then it's not dry, it's kind of the raw material. They get excited dealing with that, I think. Not as much as we do, but they get into it. They think it's cool to see the stuff from the past, not just hearing a story, but getting to see the kind of the raw materials, and to get their hands dirty with those details. But to do those deep dives, and I do it again in the 30s and the 60s, and really sink in. So if you're doing that post-war period and you only have, 1 day, 2 days, I would go deep on something like 9/11 or the election of 2000. I think either of those are kind of a good central point in the chronology. It's just out of their mind, but would really be something they're interested in. The same way I grew up always interested in Watergate, which happened, like 10 days after I was born. They're interested in 9/11, I think, right now. Or to dig into, the election of Barack Obama, or to dig into, the dot-com boom. Pick a topic that kind of lets them get their mind around a particular phenomenon at a particular time, and know that it won't stand in for everything, but it'll give them a sense of depth and the complexity there, and let them ask really interesting historical questions of that moment, rather than just trying to kind of cram every date and name that comes their way.
Well, we're about out of time, but I'm hoping you'll indulge me one last
Absolutely.
question, because I think it's a really good question to end on, asked by Teferet, who has worked with NCHE in the past, and we really appreciate her. So I love this question. I think it's a great one to end our conversation on tonight, which is a polarizing topic that is impacting teachers now is how the term critical race theory has been co-opted by the right and is being used to censor history education. What are your thoughts on how teachers, principals, and boards of education should respond and advocate for the accurate teaching of history, including the central role of white supremacy and racism in shaping American government and society?
I think first and foremost, you have to be clear about what's going on. There is an incredible degree and level of misinformation and disinformation out there that is being pushed, I think maliciously, but is being accepted by people who just simply don't know better. So I hear time and time again complaints from parents who are yelling at school boards or principals or high school teachers or elementary school teachers. The critical race theory teaches that race is the most important thing, and it makes my kid feel bad. No, critical race theory actually begins with the point that race is made up, that race is not real. There's no biological or scientific basis to it, and we should not think of it that way. Those parents would hopefully agree with that. All critical race theory does is say, hey, people used to think it was really real, and they wrote down laws and they made decisions in the courts and Congress and state legislatures along those lines. And we deal with those ramifications today. And there are still embedded forms and structural forms of racism that last today. Critical race theory isn't telling you your kid should feel bad unless your kid happens to be the one who created redlining in the 1930s, or was a Supreme Court justice in 1922 with the Ozawa case. If your kid was one of those, you have a very old kid, and yes, we might blame them. But what critical race theory does again is it says racism isn't an individual thing. Racism isn't about that's a racist over there, that person. What critical race theory does is it says racism is embedded. It is deeply entrenched in ways that we don't even know about. We're not consciously choosing to act racist some ways, but are applying racist systems in ways that have negative impact on people, right? So it's not your kid's fault. It's not your fault. If you're worried that this is going to be about your kid being blamed, you should be a huge fan of critical race theory. Second, I'd say, if you're worried your kid is being taught critical race theory, congratulations on having a child in law school, because you're not really getting critical race theory at the elementary or junior or high school level. That said, they'll still claim it's there. There's become this arc of this trope of everything I don't like is critical race theory, which is a kind of ludicrous. I've seen children's books about Ruby Bridges and Martin Luther King banned because they are somehow critical race theory. Talking about anything to do with race has been kind of swept under this. And so the book reports my kids do on Rosa Parks when they're in the second grade here in Princeton, I guess is critical race theory now. Again, that is ludicrous. And the argument here, again, from the people objecting to this seems to be, you're trying to make my kids feel bad. Again, that's not what this is about. And what I would say to them, and depending on where you are in this process, you'll have to find a gentler way to say it to them, is what they're asking for is not history. There's a common saying on the right now, facts don't care about your feelings. That's actually true. History is history. And when I introduce my class, again, to college students who are there by choice, it's a little different. But I say up front, we're going to talk about some of the uglier things that happened in American history. And we're going to talk about them because those central questions of the course I talked about, what is America supposed to do? Who counts as an American? That's when they debate them. The debates get ugly. The debates get dirty and mean. But we're going to look at them. But also I say, for better or worse, all these things happen. And being ignorant of them doesn't make you a better patriot. It just makes you ignorant. And so we're going to talk about them and we're going to address them. But again, I know that these moments of conflict are when history really comes to light, when we get to see the real values. We get to see the ways in which Americans rose to the challenge, sometimes beautifully, and sometimes they didn't. But that's the whole point of real history. So if you're worried about that, that's not critical race theory isn't bad, but that's not critical race theory. That's just history. And I think we're seeing now an effort to sweep everything under this rug as critical race theory, which again is supposed to be bad, and to sweep it all away. And I think we've got to stand our ground and say, no, this is just history. This is another reason I like using primary sources, is I want to get the raw material in people's hands as directly as possible. It's what I do in the classroom. It's what I do on Twitter. I don't ever say, I try not to say, trust me, I know a lot about this. This is my thing. You just don't have to see any evidence. I like to show the evidence because it drives home the point, but also it lets them grapple with it themselves, right? And so to anyone who is arguing that critical race theory is bad, fine, here, look at a property deed with a restrictive covenant. We'll talk about how the courts upheld this. Look at the Plessy case. Or the Perez case. Look at Rodriguez. Look at all these cases that came about, how the courts dealt with race. I show my students, again, these two cases of the 1920s, Ozawa and Thind, where the court does a flip-flop on what counts as white. At one point, they say, to be an American citizen, you have to be white, and that means you have to be from the Caucasian mountains. And so they say, well, look, Ozawa, you're Japanese. You say your skin looks white, but you're not from the Caucasian mountains. You can't be white. The next case, they have the Thind case, and he says, I am literally from those mountains. Good news for me. I'm white. I count as a citizen. And the court says, no, look at your skin color. Your skin color is clearly not white. That's what really matters. They're changing their rationale to get the result, right? That's what critical race theory is talking about, right? So don't use those terms. Just give them the material and let them examine them on their own, because it's all there. What we call critical race theory here wasn't invented in the modern age. It was named, but Martin Luther King talked about these things. Southern lawyers in the early 20th century talked about these things. Mississippi lawyer Sidney Fant Davis had a great line in 1915 in a book, horrible title, Mississippi Negro Lore or something like that. Anyway, here's a line in there, this white lawyer talking to a white audience. It says, hey, look, we all know we have certain laws we only apply to the Negroes, right? We know there's an uneven thing. He says, when you're a lawyer down here, you have to know the criminal law, the civil law, the statutes, and the Negro law. The Negro law is effectively this double standard of justice, right? This idea that the laws might appear racially neutral on the surface, but are in fact deeply racist underneath. Martin Luther King talks about that in a letter from Birmingham jail, 1963, this exact same concept. We talk about it today. This is not something new. This is something that people who lived through this on the white side and on the black side understood all too well. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't explain it in those terms, we're not telling the truth, we're hiding it, right? So that's our duty. And believe me, I get yelled at a lot. History is not fun sometimes. I think it's fascinating, but it's not always positive. It's not always uplifting, but it's there. It's who we are. It's where we came from, right? And I think we have a duty to explain and understand that. Maybe not to sympathize with the past always, but to empathize with it and understand it on its own terms. And the racial part is a huge part of that. We can't let it go.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end tonight. I think that says it all. So thank you, Dr. Kevin Kruse, for this presentation tonight. Thank you for the conversation. I've hopefully our participants felt as engaged with you as I did. This was simply fantastic. So thank
It
you.
was a pleasure being here. I wish we had more time to chat. I see other great questions in here. Thank you all for what you do, especially those of you, who are in the trenches, especially with all this nonsense going on. We all love and support the work you're doing, and thank you for that from our end.
Well, we at National Council for History Education, we can't thank you enough for your participation tonight. And thanks to all our participants for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the webinar presentation tonight. And if you'd like to have access to more of our resources or find out more about what we do or be active in our organization, please join us at www.nchatteach.org or follow us on Twitter @HistoryEd or on our Facebook and Instagram pages. If you do have questions or comments, I can be reached at matt@nche.net. And thank you all once again. And thank you, Dr. Kruse. This has just been a wonderful evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.